Hello, welcome back to Catalyzing Coherence. Today we are here with Ori Brafman. Thanks for coming on the show, Ori.
Thanks for having me.
Ori is the co-author of The Starfish and The Spider and just released a new book by the name of Radical Inclusion. Ori, I really wanted to have you on the show here because of the fact that, we are in Starfish mission and the namesake of this entire space is derivative of your book, of your work.
Which is so cool.
Yeah. And so basically I'm honored to have you here, and I'd really like to, I guess, first maybe start with unpacking what it was that led you to this insight in terms of decentralized or centralized organisms, and what it's kind of like to see that take root in the world and see communities build up around that idea, like the one that we're sitting in right now.
So the origins go all the way back to 2001. I was on a plane on September 10th from Boston to San Francisco. I woke up the next day realizing that the world was just a different place and wanted to do something to make a difference. And we co-founded a nonprofit that engaged CEOs on peace and economic development issues. Have six Israelis and 6 Palestinians, or 6 Americans and 6 Saudis. And we got funding, and people asked us 2 questions. That were good questions, but they're the wrong questions to ask. The first question was, who's in charge? And we're like, I wasn't in charge, I was 26. And the second one was, what's the strategy of the organization? And the answer was, the strategy is really to just keep on growing the network. And some of the circles focus on very specific action, and not much happened. And the circles that focused on symbolic action were actually the ones that were the most successful. The biggest one was probably the India and Pakistan group. The Pakistanis invited the Indians to come visit them after a few meetings. There was no flights between the 2 countries. And the Indians chartered a 737. And when they landed, the president of Pakistan was there. And he said, with this flight, I hereby open up the borders. And there's now flights between India and Pakistan. And people were like, how did you open up the borders? And we're like, we didn't open up the borders. It was the power of the network. And in trying to understand what happened, we turned to biology. The metaphor is, you cut off the head of a spider, it dies. You cut off the arm of a starfish, it goes on back, because there is no central head. And you think about that as a metaphor for business and society, from Alcoholics Anonymous to Wikipedia, these very distributed networks. And what's interesting about them is that the harder that you fight them, actually the stronger they become. The book came out in 2006, and it ended up in a lot of very different places. It was mandatory reading at Greenpeace. It was read in the U.S. military. Several political movements, including Occupy and the Tea Party, were influenced by it, and as well as blockchain and the early writings about Bitcoin. You think about blockchain is really empowering a starfish community and network. And a few weeks ago, I heard about Starfish Network, and I was like, emailed them up, and I was like, what are you guys doing? This is so awesome. Yeah. And this is fantastic seeing.
I think it's the same starfish icon as well that we're using.
It's so cool. It's hard to describe just how cool that is. It's that something that you write about, all of a sudden you see it like in the real world, and you're like, oh, this is really amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're kind of, I guess, perhaps in one of the tentacles, or one of the
arms. Arms
sounds
so much friendlier, right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. So, although I guess tentacle is not, that's like squid-like or octopus-like. That's not really a starfish. It's an arm. Right. It's an arm. I guess one thing that I've wondered about is why contrast with a spider specifically, given that there might be many animals out there whose head you could chop off and it would become rather incapable of much. Right. But what is it specifically about the spider in contrast to the starfish that makes it such a good example?
It was a marine biologist who helped us with the metaphor. And I like the spider because they kind of, in a weird way, look the same, right? It's kind of like a bunch of legs or arms coming out of
like surface level appearance.
Yeah,
there
exactly,
seems to be a center, and there
exactly,
seems to be
exactly.
kind of a radiation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
The publishers wanted to put a picture of a spider on the
just like
on the cover, and it triggered a lot of people, and we're like, no. It came this close to have like a spider like dangling down, and
oh wow, yeah. It's like book sales immediately reduced by like 30% because half the people can't even pick it up.
Right. You wonder what would happen, right? Those little choices, yeah.
Yeah. It's like you put it in the window of a bookstore, and like all of the bookstore's patrons just don't come anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I don't know. So I like spiders. I think spiders get a bad rep, but I do agree that they are these interesting examples of a creature that I guess everything about it is to some extent centralized. It's like even like think of it like it sits at the center of its web,
right?
And like when something well, not every spider acts this way, but archetypally when something interacts with its web, it'll go and kind of like grab it, wrap it up, and like bring it back,
right,
and, like,
right,
at the center. And so it really is this almost like a biological like black hole, like evolution,
or
like
centralization. It's
essentially like everything gets pulled
right.
into the middle,
right.
whereas the starfish is the opposite of that in terms of things get pushed to the edges. Each organ has its own, or each arm has its own. Well, not every starfish is like this, but some starfish, each arm has their own fully capable, encapsulated biological units, stomach, neurological system. And so if it splits up or if it's divided, it can, drift wherever it may need to go and then, reinstantiate its own full self once more.
Exactly. And it's still a mystery exactly how some starfish move, because the arms almost move independently, and they have to coordinate amongst each other about where to move.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we still like something so like on the surface level presumably simple,
right?
And so many biologists are probably looking at this, and yet we still haven't kind of cracked that code.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I like about the starfish is that it looks static, mm-hmm. right? But there's so much going on. Mm-hmm. And it looks like a primitive.
Yeah. Have you ever seen those time-lapse videos of tide pools?
Yeah.
Like you really like when you just look at a tide pool on the coast of California. They're numerous, especially like I guess Monterey and those types of areas. And you go to a tide pool and you look at it, and it looks like this artistic still almost in a way. And there's definitely movement in there, but it doesn't look as dynamic as you might later realize if you actually watched a time lapse of it, and there's a lot going on in there.
Right, exactly. And I like that from the outside, and it used to be, I think people are changing the perspective. People were like, wait a second, you're talking about organizations that don't have top-down leadership, but why do we care?
Yeah.
And then you see enough examples where these kind of just very different organizational structures create such change.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're starting to see it really in every industry, in every environment, and that from the outside they look like, wait a second, this isn't organized, but really there's a lot more going on than meets the eye.
Mm-hmm. One question I've asked myself when thinking about decentralized organizations, and especially within this new decentralized economic movement, is maybe stepping back to give it a little bit more of a frame.
Yeah.
I was reading a book, and it was a book by a philosopher, Manuel de Landa. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's I guess a speculative realist is what they call it. He wrote this book called 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History.
1,000 years of wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so he actually he recapitulates the past 1,000 years through 3 different lenses. And one is like this geological lens. Mm-hmm. Another is genes and flesh, and another is effectively information flows and memes.
Huh.
And it's an interesting book that you might like, but he does talk about this tension between the trade-offs that come along with centralized hierarchy versus decentralized, like mesh networks, as he calls it, mm-hmm. or decentralized organizations, where hierarchies are good at our short-term agency, or like kind of like pointing and shooting.
Right.
Yet they are subject to, they're quite less adaptive over the long term, or they might not be as well suited to highly volatile circumstances where that pointing and shooting in one direction might take you off a cliff, right? Whereas decentralized organizations are much more robust in these volatile circumstances or ecosystems, yet in the short term, it can seem chaotic and seem as if they are more subject to drift. It's harder to get everybody to move in the same direction. Does that ring true in your experience with decentralized organizations, or have you seen effective coordination from the bottom up where it doesn't actually feel chaotic either?
I think that with technology, you're actually able to coordinate more efficiently and probably more effectively. We saw that in Occupy. We started seeing that in Occupy. I think we're seeing that in blockchain, where there's actually a fair amount of coherence from the get-go. And I think it's because the nodes are able to communicate with each other much quicker and much more effectively. So if you're living in a community with a bunch of people and you don't have top-down centralization, then there's the meetings that go on for a long time until you hear, all that kind of stuff. You do need centralization, and I think the way I think about it is that centralization is very good about producing actual physical materials and coordinating that. So if you're trying to make a car, there needs to be like a plant, and yet we see companies that have brought in decentralization, like Toyota, very effectively in terms of being able to allow employees to constantly improve the process. So it's really, we can think about it as either Starfish or Spider, but where it gets really interesting is how Starfish networks exist within very large Spider organizations.
Because that is kind of the nature of a network, right? Where you look at a network in biology or any network that emerges like the internet, you get some points of centralization in much more overall distributed networks, right? So it's like these points of centrality emerge largely because, there are some mathematicians that even put out the hypothesis that this is just a universal aspect of flows. So Adrian Bejan is has this constructal law where he's talking about like a flow through any network will tend towards these certain power law distributions because the flow will minimize the distance or the number of hops that it has to take across the network, and that ends up creating kind of some element of centralization. But that creation of centralization also then pushes the network to certain types of fragility, right? So it's like the too big to fail types of fragility start arising out of that, and you have to go through a whole nother cycle of reevaluating and breaking those up. And it kind of is also like the type of like breaking down monopolies as well. It's like we see these patterns emerge everywhere. It's like centralization emerges, and then we have to go through a cycle of decentralization. And it's like, I don't know if you can escape that. Do you think you can escape that, or is that just a feature of reality?
I think it just keeps on swinging from one to the other. And if you're too centralized, you're going to be too rigid. You're going to be too fragile. You will concentrate wealth in non-sustainable ways. If you're too decentralized, you're going to be somewhat inefficient, and someone can come in and centralize as a way to kind of create the flow or the information more effectively. And then I think we're bound to just be centralized, decentralized, centralized, decentralized. I wonder what's going to happen with all these currencies, whether now
90% of them are dead now.
Right, exactly. And are those going to get consolidated? Is there going to be a centralizing figure? What are the implications about the dollar has an army behind it? What happens when there's a currency that doesn't? And
it's like a physical army versus math and energy. I suppose,
exactly.
What the kind of the battlefield is stacking up to look like.
Right. Which is super interesting.
Fascinating.
And so you're seeing who would have thought, right, 10 years ago, or that the world of finance would be the world that would be so heavily all of a sudden disrupted and decentralized. You'd think like, well, you're in a bank, you're good, right?
I mean, especially after 2008, even when such irresponsible behavior was demonstrated and such economic risk was injected into our overall economy, and the government came and kind of like saved the day and propped them up, propped these banks up even further. And it's like that should, in theory, reinforce one's. I guess one perspective is like, oh yeah, well the banks are here to stay, and it's unlikely that they're going to get disrupted because the government is also backing it, and like all the cards are stacked against disruption in that sector.
Right.
And still, it created this genesis moment of Bitcoin, right? And like this the genesis block was effectively this political statement as much as it was a technological innovation, and that's led to this whole new world that we're in, where everything is kind of getting flipped on its head in the financial realm.
Which is so interesting that these networks tend to, when you look at a decentralized network, I found that almost always there is a very core set of values in the middle of them, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous, unfortunately Al-Qaeda, Wikipedia, right? There's a core value that's very easy to describe, and I think the same thing with some of the cryptocurrencies, right? Yeah. There's a core value, and that's also maybe a question about which currencies are going to survive and which. I wonder about whether there's a core value there or whether it's a.
Yeah, I think that's an essential question, given that, I mean, at least I've done for the past couple of years, I've been researching kind of the evolution of how humans represent value, and money is money as we know it today is a subset of that whole long evolutionary process, moving from Incans tying knots into strings called quipu, and like representing different localized community values, or shell trading, where it's like you had different types of shells that map to different behaviors. So there might be certain types of currency for hunting, or certain types of currency for trading, or certain types, very specialized. But as we aggregated and like became larger and larger in terms of our centralized agricultural societies, the costs of that specialized currency, they were too high. You needed something that was more abstract, that was more fungible, right? So we got these currencies that were universalized, or kind of like gold, right? Everybody acknowledged that this metal was valuable, and so we kind of abstracted universally. And now we have the dollar that's like so abstract. It's like, what does the dollar really symbolize? Like, as you were talking about earlier, like, is it the military power? Is it the symbol of my leverage in my personal economic reality? Is it a symbol of love when I use it to purchase flowers for my girlfriend, something like that?
Right.
It's all of these and none of them. It kind of supersedes all of this stuff. And I kind of look at that as like we've reduced the way we express value to kind of one dimension, and that might be too low resolution for us to actually map our human values onto our economic behavior. And I think people are feeling that these days. And maybe this cryptocurrency, back to your point, is really an emergent competition for, kind of exploding that one dimension into a whole, field of competition of competing mission statements. And it might come back to another, like a new balance. That's not just one currency. Maybe it's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, who knows where it'll end. But maybe we're in this kind of process. If that makes sense. I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense. I've been thinking a lot about this. So the dollar and the dollars that I have in my wallet, to some degree, they represent trust.
Exactly.
So you trust that the dollar is authentic, and there's pretty good ways of, right, the kind of eyeballing it looks like a real dollar or not. There's trust in the U.S. government, regardless of our debt and everything else. Like,
some amount of a trust in just inertia.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that cryptocurrencies try to make that trust more lateral and more a digital trust. And I think that there's obvious challenges with, so much of as we're saying, concentration in certain countries by certain individuals, and you're like, and I wonder whether there's a way of combining the in-person trust and the digital trust. What happens when there's, and I don't think this exists yet, But if a group of people, say a group of people here in San Francisco, a few hundred people, decide to trust each other and have a currency that isn't necessarily wide open, but a currency that is only within that community, and where you already have trust, and you're able to actually do commerce, and probably do commerce in a way that we like to do in San Francisco, local agriculture, and you have a doctor and a lawyer and whatever else in that network whom you trust, and you can conduct interactions with. And then if you have another island of also people who trust each other, and then in real person, say in Boston or in Germany or wherever it is, then you can kind of hop between between these areas of trusted networks. And you can also then do commerce with people there. So it's almost like I guess micro ubiquity.
I've been in some of the writing I've been doing, I've been kind of like thinking these as like moral meshworks in a way. Like you have like these emergent structures or groups of people, collectives that share values, and they can encapsulate that into a tokenization form or something along those lines, where internally within their network there are like efficiencies to interacting with people who share those same values. The interesting question there is, and tell me what you think about this, because I'm trying to poke holes in it. So please poke some holes in this idea for me. The idea of, so right now we have obviously like polarization is an issue in our political landscape.
Why do you say that?
Like,
what makes you say that?
Like, whenever I turn on a TV or the radio or the internet or talk to people in the street, it's like, we have this deeply amplified polarity in our perception of the world. And the language, even I was looking at, there's a Stanford study that measured the evolution of language used by different the two political parties, and that's also dividing across time. So it's like not only do we have different perspectives, we're also beginning to use entirely different languages to talk about the perspectives, which makes it even less likely that we can come to terms about whatever the given topic is. And so on top of that structural polarity, you layer the economic incentives of perhaps media actors to create more friction and heat around the polarity for revenue and for profit, which also drives the pattern. So there are a lot of incentives further driving us away from one another. But it would be interesting to me, and this is obviously overly generalized and abstract, but like a world in which there was something like Democrat coin and Republican coin, right? And I'm not saying that should be what it is, but just the model here, like, bear with me. They have different values, and yet in the same way that there are positive returns to trade, and that's why trade emerges in across nations, right? There are certain efficiencies to trade, and that's why we fundamentally trade, is because like if I specialize in making one good and you specialize in making another good, I should trade with you as opposed to making it myself, and we all get more, right? It would seem that similar things might hold true within the Democratic and Republican spheres, given that there's also been studies that show that there are different types of personality psychology that thrive within those different types of political domains, and therefore you might expect them to be good at different types of things. And so there might be positive returns to interaction there, right? And so you could trade the coins with one another, but there would be some sort of friction associated with it. So it's like, think about getting a bill at the end of each month where it's like the distance between you and another and all the people that you interacted with economically has a actual cost to it. And so like you could see like, oh, this is like your ideological bill for the end of the month. And that actually, instead of incentivizing polarity, would kind of create almost an attraction. And not that they should be the same thing or that they should ever come to a unity, but it would actually perhaps give people a reason to think about what their ideological polarization is costing them.
I think that's intriguing. I think it brings up the question of, is the rift in our country Republican, Democrat, or is there something even more basic to the rift? And I think what you're hinting at is I think that the rift might be traditional versus modernism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a critique of the quote unquote, well, let's just say a critique of modernists is that we lack community. And that because of that, there's very little variance allowed to on certain hot topic issues. To be an ally, you kind of can't. There isn't as much freedom to have different viewpoints.
Mm-hmm.
Is a critique of modernism, and a critique of traditionalism is that it lacks equality and lacks progress, right? And doesn't give rights to. Concentrates rights and as opposed to distribute rights. So I wonder if, a way of thinking about how do you, maybe it would be a modernist coin and a traditionalist coin, or,
and like that could also map to something like value of stability versus value of experimentation or change or things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating to think about like how do we speak about these topics in terms of, because this pattern keeps emerging in our conversation here, where it's like it's not about one or the other, it's about the interplay between the two,
right?
And the evolutionary, what emerges from that interplay, right? Over time, and how we update our understanding of where we need to be based on the combination of how people associate with either tradition or modernism or postmodernism versus or order versus or stability versus progress or however people might identify. It's really the interplay. Yet the language is always, well, not always, but it tends towards the tribal. It tends towards the identification with one over the other,
right?
And the superiority of one over the other,
right?
As opposed to the necessity of both, even though it might be uncomfortable, to figure out how that interaction plays out over time.
Right. And how do you? I like that. How do you quantify the interaction?
Yeah, precisely.
Right. And the concern over, hey, what happens when we don't have interaction with one another?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that also relates to how do you ensure that there's, what I really like about the space is that there's community here, and so often community is right. It oftentimes seems lacking.
Oh yeah, I mean in the modern, I mean we have kind of like a, I guess, maybe at least a 50-year history so far of kind of like increasingly nuclearizing or like isolating the individual within society, or like focusing on the individual as the source of targeted marketing, or like bringing the individual identity to the fore in service of like selling things to the individual, as opposed to saying, oh, you don't need these products, maybe you could get the value you're seeking in community.
Right. The individual can mess up a lot. I know as an individual mess up a lot. I kind of trust community more to be to make the right decisions. And how do we think about making decisions within a community through a community lens?
I think that probably relates to people's personal level of comfort with either delegating to the community or having that autonomy. Probably relates to both their personality and also personal experience. Like I know to some extent, and I've seen, there's a funny YouTube video about the process of designing a stop sign by committee. Right. And so I think it's this thing that like every like designer or engineer can relate to. Where it's like, by the time you're done with it, you have this like pink and blue stop sign, and like there's like 8 different logos on it, and the actual text trying to get people to stop is in like 2-point font at the bottom, and it's a paragraph describing all of the terms and conditions.
What does it mean to stop?
And then it's like
is it a pause? How long of a stop?
Yeah, and then like the video ends by it shows like all these new stop signs at the intersections, and then you just hear like cars crashing, right? And then cut to black, fade to black. Right. And so people do experience both the positives and negatives of communal decision making. Although perhaps the type of community or group decision making that most people are familiar with takes place within spider organizations that don't have good templates for collective action.
So, Burning Man is happening as we're recording this.
Yes, yes.
Not there this year.
Not there this year.
I think Burning Man is a really, really good example of a very starfish community that actually is very effective at getting stuff done.
Yeah.
So a few years ago,
I mean, building a city in the
building
desert
a city
is
in
no
the
small
desert
feat.
is
Yeah.
no small feat.
Yeah.
I was at the airport there. There's an airport, and I was like, wow, they're really kind of. I volunteered, and I started talking to people, and I was like, wow, this is really well run. And I talked to this guy, and I was like, so what do you do, outside of Burning Man?
Yeah.
And he's like, I work at JFK, and you're like, oh, okay. Like, this isn't something that you.
They actually found like flight controllers.
Who are volunteering.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of a myth of the moment that your community where there's no like top-down structure that everything becomes by committee. But Burning Man kind of offers a different approach, which is, or a different solution, which is like, do what you want to do. As long as it doesn't hurt anyone, and people will either support you or get out of the way, so that it actually allows for a lot of individual creativity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that tension between that just pure freedom and the. I mean, I guess the traditional way of expressing this is like you're free to swing your arms around until you start kind of like hitting people in the face, right? And but what you're talking about goes beyond that, because you're not just talking about just like swinging your arms around mindlessly. It's really about like, what are you building, and like what do you bring to the table creatively, and how is that enmeshing with enriching or hurting the community around you, right? Like how does it actually integrate? And maybe that's an interesting way of looking at these types of, the way of providing individual autonomy for creativity that also can emerge into something collectively valuable.
Exactly. So my older brother gives me grief over going to Burning Man, and is like, why are you paying all this money, and you're like in the middle of the desert, and it's like he doesn't get it, and
you're paying all that money to not shower for a week.
Right, exactly. I forgot where to shower, but showering is important. I think that so I do speak in at big companies and Department of Defense, and I'm always like, Burning Man. People are like, what are you going to talk about Burning Man? And I think that we need to. Have you been?
Yeah, I've been one time. Yeah, I plan on going back, but I don't think it's something that I can do every year. Although, and then, I have respect for everybody who goes every year.
Right.
And I'm glad people do that. But for me, it's like it's such like a almost like a nuclear or psychological explosion.
Yeah,
there's so much stimulation, and I'm fairly sensitive to that. And so when I went, I felt like it literally kind of like took my mind and recalibrated things, and then I was on a different track. Right? And it's like I need a couple years
to like
changing tracks, right?
So I actually have the same view of it, and I think of it as a almost like a pilgrimage, honestly. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to view Burning Man through a spiritual lens, and that Burning Man is a very coherent, very spiritual experience for a lot of people, who then come back to Silicon Valley and operate by a certain set of norms that aren't explicit to the outside viewer. Yeah, but that actually people like. I think it's as close as we have to a church here in San Francisco. Yeah, there's definitely. That's one thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about after going my first time is, there's so much energy and so much. I had so many ideas about things that I had seen, and ways that I had seen people interacting, and ways that I had seen people co-creating, or sharing information, or just helping one another out, and the amount of synchronicity there, and wondering how can this be brought back into the, I guess as it's called, the default world, right? And I guess my questions along those lines took me in two directions. One was, seeing Burning Man, appreciating what we have in the default world through the lens of its capacity to allow for the creation of something like Burning Man on top of it, Right. Right.
So it's like sometimes too many people are a little bit too quick to say like, oh, the default world sucks. Where it's like, well, really, it's like the default
51
world,
weeks of work takes
has so much excess energy and value that's being created in this other world that it allows for us to experiment in new modes of interaction beyond the default world. And that was very clearly put to me. I was sitting in like a kind of like a group talk, and there was a Q&A at the end at my camp in Burning Man, and somebody was like, "What would happen, like just hypothetically, if this entire community of Burning Man was cut off from the real world, right? From the default world. And like, this wasn't just a week-long thing. It's like, now we're here for a year.
Right.
And you only have what you have. Like, how long can that community sustain its values, its intellectual and its emotional and its psychological and spiritual state and values before you start descending into much more rivalrous behavior? Right? How long before you have roving bands of people taking other people's water and things of that nature? And it's like, I think it was just an interesting question that was put to the group, where it's like, how much of what we're talking about can exist because we have created surplus, Right.
And that so much of Burning Man is based on the idea of everyone has, well, not everyone, but most people have too much of everything coming there. So there's no scarcities. So it's,
there's definitely like a revelry in that scarcity.
Right. That's a really good question. And it might be like one of those snake biting its own.
Yeah, the Ouroboros pattern.
Yeah, where there is, I think, a spirit of gifting and a gift economy and of leave no trace that does actually permeate through San Francisco and the Bay Area. Yeah. And of art, of ideation, and that spirit, at least within the community, that that, like, I don't know of huge rifts between Burning Man tribes out in this very competitive world here. Yeah. That spirit of generosity still seems to exist even throughout the year.
That was the other side of it, where I was curious about, what are the pathways, because as you were talking about before, there's like perhaps an implicit diffusion of that culture into the San Francisco area of these values of Burning Man that kind of sneaks its way into, or maybe sneaks isn't the right word, but kind of works its way into the cracks of our institutions and our companies and our culture. But I was also curious about like, well, there's all of this potential energy being built up there. Like, it seems like there might be like good for more formal off ramps into society, right?
Right.
Kind of sustain that culture of emergent community between all the different camps outside of the specific context. Because I know all the camps, like within camps outside of the Burning Man, like 1 week a year, those camps stay in contact.
Stay in contact, and
but not necessarily. There's I would think there's probably an exponential fall off of like inter-camp communication.
Right.
Right.
And I think that a lot of this discussion, and I've kind of been in the discussions, right, where it's like we view it as an event or as a festival, and we're like, what are the implications of this? And I think that if we viewed it as you're going to church. So if I told you, hey, we're going to church together, and in this church we're brothers, and then we would say, like, of course you can't be in church. We're not monks. We're not going to be in church 24/7.
Yeah, it's not the monastic lifestyle.
Yeah. Which is, and that's a question: what would happen if there's a few monks? But beyond that, like, you go to pilgrimage, and and what happens when you come back from the pilgrimage? And I think that we're seeing elements of this view in blockchain and crypto and all, right, of this kind of like more egalitarian, more trust-based, and maybe that's one way in which it's kind of seeped out into the default world.
Yeah, it's definitely seeping out into the world. It's fascinating, all the forms that it's taking, some of which I find extremely valuable and positive, and others I am kind of curious about in terms of like, can there be forms of that are also when they come out into the world, they manifest in ways that might be like less, might cause harm. But And I think maybe that's a good pivot for us to go into your new book.
Sure.
In terms of this question. You're not on the harm side, but on just the
yeah, right. Like, just tell us about how you're harming the world.
No. elements of this culture moving out into the broader culture. Radical inclusion is to some extent one of those components, and it is one of those things that's moving through or becoming more. The word inclusion itself is just becoming used much more widely in many either corporate or social contexts, political contexts as well. And I would be interested to hear, what is the thrust that you're putting forward with your book, and what is your perspective on this idea of radical inclusion? Like, what does radical and inclusion mean, like in your mind, and like when you put them together, where does that take us? What does that imply?
So several years ago, I was contacted by this guy in the U.S. Army, and as background, I went to UC Berkeley. I was a peace studies major. I teach at Berkeley. You can guess my worldview. And I had never had any contact with anyone in the military, really. And it was this guy. He was a 4-star general. My first question was, is there a 5-star general? Apparently there aren't. And I didn't know what to call him, so I called him Marty. And at the time, he was in charge of leadership and training in the Army, and then eventually became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the head of the military. And the military has been looking at how do you take on networks like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that are distributed. And he brought me in, and we had a conversation about, hey, how do you actually use the Starfish principles in action?
Yeah.
And over the last several years, we've created different networks within U.S. Army and U.S. military to reach out to communities that they never would have engaged in. For 2 weeks, people from the Army come to Berkeley. There's a bunch of different networks and circles focused on very different topics.
Yeah. Are they in uniform?
They don't come in uniform.
Okay.
I've had them come in uniform. It's a little better when they don't, and people don't know, and you can kind of tell. Like the haircuts kind of give it away.
The buzz cut isn't the most popular haircut. On
yeah, right, exactly. Across from People's Park.
Yeah.
But wonderful things have emerged from it. So the Berkeley City Council had a unanimous proclamation when they heard about this, and they declared June, a day in June, as Bridging the Military-Civilian Divide Day. And you're like, the Berkeley City Council did that? And you're like, what happens when we, and this sounds so kind of basic, but what happens when we allow people to actually talk to each other who are seemingly from very different worlds? And lo and behold, we have far more that unites us than divides us.
Yeah.
And what if we focus on shared beliefs and shared values? I had this a few years ago. I was in Kansas in this hunting lodge. Now I'm a vegan, and this guy was talking to me about bow hunting, and we're surrounded by all these animal heads. And he's like, you Berkeley folks aren't that bad. And I'm like, oh, well, thank you. And the conversation that, especially in these days, the conversation in this country is so divided that we need inclusion, not just as a nice to have, but as a strategic imperative. And the reason we titled the book Radical Inclusion is that it's about allowing all sorts of participation all the time, and as an inclusion as a default.
Yeah.
The conversation around inclusion a lot of times, unfortunately, seems more like detention. Like, okay, we'll sit you down, we'll tell you what,
like
why
you're going to HR for your diversity and inclusion.
Right.
You're retraining, right? So
and what if we think about this as this is actually really necessary for strategic success, and it's necessary for two components. First, we need inclusion in order to have better information on the edges of the network. So can I convince you right now that there's a fire going on in Oakland across the bay? If I knew your social media, I could probably show you a bunch of pictures to show you that like Oakland's on fire. And then if I go to another person and I know their social media patterns, I can show them a bunch of pictures that Oakland is fine. Mm-hmm. And I can actually have these
reality tunnels.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you do if you need to find out whether there's an actual fire? Well, you call someone in Oakland that you trust, mm-hmm. right? And eventually, probably you can use some very thin blockchain to certify that that person is who you think that they're talking to. And they're like, yes, Oakland's I'm right here. Oakland seems to be on fire. Or Oakland is fine. And you think about that from both a national perspective and also from a small business. You need to verify the information that's as we're getting so much noise. Yeah. You need to have people around you who are going to be able to verify information, and also people around us. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of how our brain works with surprise neurons. Mm-hmm. So our brain really isn't listening constantly to all of the information around it. Neurons are monitoring stuff, and then when something is kind of surprising to that neuron, then it'll only
it's like sufficient novelty.
Right,
and then
exactly.
Like that's always interacting with habituation in this kind of dynamic tension between, is this something new and worth paying attention to, or is it happening so frequently that, okay, now it's just a background feature?
Exactly. Yeah. And how do we think about that then as a leader, mm-hmm. to have diverse enough neurons around you, yeah, that you're actually being able to get the right information at the right time?
Yeah.
And you need that exponentially more the more noise that you have in the environment. The reason our brains have that, right, is because we can't be paying attention to everything around us and not lose concentration.
Yeah. Because that's the interesting thing, is like the default is exclusivity in that way. And not exclusivity as in like, oh, this is an exclusive club or something, but exclusivity as in you can't necessarily pay attention to everything like you're saying, and therefore by default to understand anything you have to pay attention to a very small subset of what's out there.
Right. And so in a way we're kind of pushing out actually the filtration.
Yeah.
So our consciousness isn't necessarily aware of it, but we're still tuned in.
Yeah, the subconscious, the process that gives rise to conscious awareness is itself aware.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you need inclusivity really in order to get good information. And then you need inclusivity in order to then disseminate the information that people feel that they are a part of something.
Yeah.
Whether it's and having the feeling that they've participated. Mm-hmm. And we can ask whether companies or whether countries operate within a model of inclusivity or not, mm-hmm. and we can look at how effective their efforts are. And if we just look at it rather than from a normative, but from a strategic perspective, then I think that
like a functional perspective.
A functional perspective, like you need inclusivity in order to be effective, and mm-hmm. Is exclusivity making you less effective? And we can just ask that simple question.
Yeah. I think from this perspective of like the functional, if we take this functional line of analysis with respect to inclusivity, what I think I'm hearing you say is that different potential members of the network act as different types of sense organs.
Yep.
Really, right? It's like, in theory, if you had the choice of having either just your eyes or your eyes and your ears and your nose and your skin, you want different sense organs so that you can kind of triangulate what's actually out there in reality.
Yes.
And but then that also begs the question of along which dimensions are we interested in inclusivity, and how are we how do we have the conversation about all the dimensions of inclusivity? Because like one thing that was just recently interesting along these lines is, I don't know if you saw the news with respect to Facebook and the senior engineer at Facebook who wrote this kind of dissenting opinion within Facebook about basically a monoculture, political monoculture, and saying that they wanted to create a space for conservative perspectives to be able to exist and add to a conversation, not necessarily perspectives that are, trying to attack people or hurt people or anything, but just, I see the world differently than you, and I want to be able to speak about it in this space and have that perspective integrated into the overall actions of our organization. And they were making the case that, given the scrutiny that Facebook is faced with respect to congressional investigations and being very much in the public eye with respect to, the issues with Russia, it's probably a good thing to have multiple perspectives represented inside the company as well as outside the company.
Right.
But as one might imagine, this person and the members of the group are being kind of attacked by the immune system within Facebook. Not everyone within Facebook, but some people now say, oh, like, you are making me feel excluded or unsafe by your desire to be included. Right. And so I'm curious, in this radical inclusion framework, how do we think about situations like this? Not to put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, right. So I'd have two answers. The first is a way to think about inclusion is a way of it's about a sense of belonging, and I think we kind of misuse a lot of, like, when people are like, I need to be included, and people are like, it becomes very combative, and you're like, and it's are you excluded, included? Like, is a very kind of heavy kind of conversation.
Yeah.
If someone comes in and says, I want to feel a sense of belonging. How can I feel more of a sense of belonging? Well, you can do A, B, C, and D, or I can say, like, hey, Matt, how can I make you feel like you belong here? Because you do. And, well, it's like, well, what you do really matters.
Yeah.
I can give you joint memories and joint efforts. There's actually specific things that you can do. And I think then the conversation also becomes, we so focus on the macro.
Yeah. The abstractions.
That it's sometimes really good to just go to the very, very micro and think about, how do we run a hour-long meeting? And how do we make sure that in this hour-long meeting, different people have a voice, and that it's oftentimes it's about not transmitting, it's about listening to people, right? Amplifying voices that are interesting or that are useful. And if we use that model inside, then probably a lot of people aren't going to be like, hey, I don't feel included. You're like, yeah, okay, great. Like, come talk to us, come participate. Let's not make it kind of a big, like, when we talk about, like, are people included in this company or not? Like, I don't know. Like, are you included in this hour-long meeting? Yeah, I can figure that out. And that it emerges from that up rather than.
Yeah, that seems to be very much the case in terms of the types of signals that we're amplifying on, for example, social media. Like, oftentimes we're amplifying these signals that are the least likely to mesh well with our evolved interpersonal realities. Like, you and I sitting here in a room, it's like, I can see you, I can see your facial, movements, I can hear your voice. Like, I know, like, I can get a sense for whether you're comfortable or not. We can kind of build a reciprocity here together. I know your intonation, like, all of these things. I have so many data points to kind of understand where you're at, and I can adjust to that because I can do it consciously, but I also have billions of years of evolutionary biology behind me, helping me to stabilize with you, right? Because, while there are reasons for conflict, there are many more reasons for stability evolutionarily, like within our tribes.
So we're not cats. So you put us in the same room, we're going to try to get along.
We're like these we're very social creatures, right? We kind of like swim in a sea of socialization, and so much of what we've built as humanity is built or predicated upon this ability for humans to find cooperative paths, right? So, even when in competition.
I've been fascinated with this. I think you crystallize the issue so that one 15-minute conversation is not the same as 15 one-minute conversations, or as 30 half-minute conversations. and that we're trying to pretend that they do, that they are the same.
Yeah.
But that so much of the signal is lost.
Yeah. Especially when like, you remove the human and you replace it with just text on a screen.
Right. Exactly.
Well, right.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm really curious, and I'm excited to see what technologies like, maybe VR, but also AR can do for these types of interactions. Like obviously more in-person real interaction is ideal, and we want to promote that as much as possible. But absent that capacity where it's like, that's much harder for me to do with someone in Europe who's on Twitter, right? I can't just be like, hey, come fly over here to California and we'll grab a coffee, right?
Right.
But other modes of technology might be able to bring more humanizing aspects of the conversation into the perceptual reality of that interaction.
Have you ever interacted with anyone in VR, like VR to VR?
I have, but it was maybe a couple years ago, so it's probably come a ways.
How was it?
Then. Janky. It's like, the cool thing is that you can focus attention on certain aspects of like, so if you're a VR avatar, in theory, you could basically also have like a heart rate monitor on you and like, skin conductance and like things like that. And it's like, as we're having conversation, I could see your stress levels, right? Like you could turn different colors or something. Like you could like literally like you could actually like amplify and create a communication feedback loop there between people, or even simple things like doesn't even have to necessarily be VR, but just think about a social media world in which even something where it was along the lines of like you had some sort of little like Twitter dynamic avatar that as you interacted with people, it would evolve. And like, if you were trolling, and people kind of like marked you as troll, like you would actually evolve into a troll, right?
You look at,
but like if people observed your conversations and said, oh, that person's actually helping to divide the gap, like you might actually have some sort of like archetype of like a negotiator or something, like those things could emerge and people could have personas. And I'm not saying this would solve the problem, but you would have perhaps one more data point. Like when you look at the tweet, you'd also look at like another data point, or at least something else that gives you a little bit of context to not just who that person is in the moment, as perceived by you, but what does the community feel about this person over time? And humans use that information. There's a lot of human behavior that's like the group watching how the group is treating people, right?
Yeah, which is interesting. Kind of the Facebook question that you raised. So I think that an effective way of having these discussions is asking people, when have you felt like you're the only? And that question very quickly goes beyond gender and...
you said, when have you felt like you are the only?
The only in the room.
The only something.
The only something.
Yeah.
The only engineer, the only... what have you. And that, and I'm not going to make a bunch of assumptions, but maybe if you have that kind of conversation, and even the guy who wanted to have more conservative voices heard, and say, well, I'm maybe feeling like the only person from a more conservative background. And,
sure.
And then maybe there's a conversation about what they want, what they actually want to have happen, and that maybe that it, who knows, maybe. Maybe they don't just want their voices heard, which is a very basic human emotion, but maybe they also want the conversation to actually be rich. Maybe underneath all of that, maybe they really care about the company, and they want to make sure that it comes to the right conclusion. And all of a sudden, when I talk about what I care about and what you care about, then that's going to be a lot more connective, and all of a sudden I can do something with that.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, again, how much of that conversation is in person? How much of it is in technology? What happens when it's heightened technology? And who knows? I mean, we'll still find out, right? I'm not thinking about myself as an avatar and what avatar I would look like.
Well, I mean, just maybe tying those two threads together, along with something that you mentioned earlier, it's like, how do we find ways of focusing on shared space, right? How do we find ways of refocusing or framing along the dimensions of shared values or shared backgrounds or shared understanding of one another's humanity, right?
Right.
So many cases, so many times, at least, especially over the past couple of years, since Trump has kind of thrown a hand grenade in this whole situation, the claims to, there's basically, it seems so much more frequent that I see people isolating problems around very specific groups that then also make the claim like, well, you can't understand me.
Right.
Right. And it's like, you can't understand me because you're not me. And it's like, I have a very hard time with that line of reason, because you can also take it all the way down to the level of the individual. Like if I were arguing with my girlfriend, or we were having a difficult conversation about something, and I was like, well, you just can't understand me because you're not me. Like that's an end, that's a non-starter. Like we can't make progress past then. It's like, yeah, no one else is me either. And therefore apparently no one in the world can understand me. And then I'm just going to go be upset about whatever I'm upset about, and not be able to figure out like how it might relate to other aspects of human beings,
right?
And their experience.
But gladly we have language, and gladly we have empathy, and mirror neurons, and you can actually
so how do we tap into that? Right? So how do we say like, actually, like I'm upset because of this pattern of behavior,
right?
And what pattern of behavior that you and I share could act as a bridge for us to understand, the problem and work together to solve the problem. Right.
So I have this. This is a hypothesis. I haven't been able to get the really good numbers on this. I think it's American Psychological Association, before every major election, they look at stress levels.
Like as measured by cortisol.
I don't think they're. I think it's self-reporting, but self-reporting about. Stress is one of the only things that we are very accurate about reporting. So if I ask you how stressed you are from 1 to 5.
The irony.
Yeah, right? We're very honest with ourselves about it, and it's okay in our society to be like, I'm feeling really stressed. And, so if I was looking at your stress hormones and asking you, like, there's
actually correlation.
There's a very high correlation.
Okay.
And in the last election, my understanding is that the stress level amongst Republicans was something like 2 out of 5, not very stressed. And stress levels amongst Democrats, traditional Democrats, was like 4 out of 5 or something really, really. Wow. And then you think about this, and the more...
Which doesn't match the normative narrative around that election leading up to it.
Well, the Democrats were stressed about what would happen if the Republicans won.
Yeah, just the hypothetical of Trump. But I mean, so it's like you'd expect, like there's the hypothetical specter of Trump leading up to the election, but there was also like every news source ever saying that it was a foregone conclusion that Hillary was going to win.
And you can also say that stress was probably a better predictor of the election.
Yeah.
Interestingly, right?
So like there's like the what you might point at is like the unconscious Democratic.
The unconscious
Democratic,
right?
Kind of knew in a way that they weren't on as stable ground as they were claiming or thinking.
And that stress isn't a very connective emotion. So if I told you I'm feeling really stressed right now, like
it's very isolating, very isolating.
It's very isolating. Yeah. And so if you have a bunch of people in this country who are feeling very stressed about a whole host of very important issues, climate change, immigration, and feeling very, very stressed about it. And there's another person in the country that for some reason isn't feeling stressed about it. That stress is not a very good, if you're stressed out, then people from the outside will say like, you're stressed out, and I'm not gonna necessarily wanna have a conversation with you about why you're stressed out.
Yeah.
Like, and I've been wondering about how much of the isolation has been, or the separation has been, levels of stress. Most people I know in this area are highly stressed about what's going on in the world, right?
Yeah.
But how do we effectively communicate that?
Because there's also something about like when you're stressed, you kind of turn to the in-group. Right, as well. Right? Like when you're stressed, you literally like circle the wagons. As this response to a taxation on your perceived survivability of whatever situation you're in, right? Like I guess and it's amplified now because this level of perceived existential threat as a result of something like Trump being elected,
right,
is greatly amplified by all the other signals that are pushing this into our world, right?
Right, and I think that's kind of something that we have to deal with as a country. So if there was a fire in this room,
yeah,
I don't know why I keep on using fire examples, right?
No fire in the room.
No fire in the room, right?
But if there were,
and let's see that you see it, and you're like, "There's a fire, get out!" Right?
Yeah.
And I'd be sitting there like, "Nope, there isn't a fire," and you're like, "But there's a fire right there,"
yeah.
and then that would actually elevate your.
Yeah.
It would be very hard for you if we're both looking at the same thing, and I'm like, "I don't see, I don't think it's a big deal." How do you?
It's like the idea behind like gaslighting in a way,
yeah,
right? Where it's like I'm acting in a particular way that makes you question your own frame of reference and sanity,
right?
And I guess how do you respond to that? And you could respond to that by either questioning your own reality or like giving into what that person is saying, or you could push that other person away and say like, you know, you're disturbing my perception of reality, and I don't want that stress anymore.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which.
So yet another polarizing factor.
Right. Yet another polarizing factor. Yeah. Which again, I think. In the book we talk about climate change and. You know, people who are, 47% of the country doesn't believe in climate change? You know?
Something like that. Fairly high levels, yeah.
And they're looking around at what they think are very valid studies, saying like, no, this isn't a big deal, not a and that these people aren't insane.
Yeah.
They're just looking at inaccurate information.
Yeah, or they're viewing the world through a different value frame in a way, right? I mean, like to some extent, like I've heard people put forth the argument that perhaps the best way of solving climate change is pushing forward to a point where we're forced to solve it technologically. Like
right.
we're actually forced the issue. I'm a little bit like I'm somewhat of a cynic in this respect, right. Where I feel as if the pattern of human behavior tends to be we wait until the last minute and then scramble to do things right. when things are almost unbearably painful.
We're like kids doing like the homework, like when it's like it's too late and now you're like,
we're constantly trying to solve these collective action problems to extend our ability to act further into the future.
Right.
But you know, this is really the first time that the child of humanity has been dealt the hand of existential risk and you know, I don't think the risk of climate change is existential in and of itself. I think it can trigger human action that will make it existential for our species, right? The Earth will be fine, like whether we're here or not, over a course of like a billion years, right?
Yeah.
The question is like, are we going to
be there?
Make things so unstable and volatile for ourselves that we then bring out the worst angels of our nature that, you know, start pressing buttons and detonating nuclear weapons, right? Like, or triggering mass migrations or things of that nature, right? So it's like, it's always this trade-off game of where are we and how can we solve these problems collectively, yet and this maybe ties all the way back into the Starfish versus Spider stuff. It's like the platform or the technology of states and the Westphalian state, it's not something that's always existed. Like we have to look at that as a technology, and that technology might not be very well suited to solving these types of global collective action problems.
Exactly.
Right? Even if they say that they're willing to do so, the ability to actually act that out. Like if China comes to the table, for example, and says, oh yeah, we're going to reduce emissions by X, Y, or Z, and that actually threatens their economic integrity, what's the likelihood that they're going to act in accordance with a Kyoto Protocol versus act in their own economic interests, right?
Which you're already seeing to some degree from a Starfish Spider perspective, that states are coming in and saying like, well, that's fine what the federal government is, but California is, you know, and doing potentially, I mean, I think this is a very serious problem, but they're at least going in the right direction when the federal government is unwilling or unable to take action.
Yeah, well, that goes to the or speaks to the power of, or at least brings into question the power of bottom-up organization again, right? Where it's like you can make this argument that we are capable of creating or how capable are we of creating a sufficiently powerful bottom-up coordinated force that could, in theory, act at the scale of global climate? Like, I think that's a really interesting challenge. And I think it might actually be the only way to break the game theoretic stalemate that we are stuck within at the nation state level. Like, you need to have some sort of simultaneous coordination to kind of unlock or to break through that, to break through the stalemate at which we find ourselves. Right. And it's not clear that that's going to happen within the traditional political frameworks.
It hasn't yet.
It certainly hasn't yet. And it's unclear to me that it's actually possible. Right. Like, game theoretically. Right. In the mindset of zero sum, I win, you lose, or my nation has to trade off its economic productivity for the collective benefit of humanity 50 years down the road, right? It's like those are the exact type of game theoretic or economic calculations that we seem to perform poorly at, whether we're talking about individuals making their own personal economic calculations or states making economic calculations. Right. And so how do we actually coordinate?
So that our interactions as humans becomes much more potentially distributed, right? Yeah. And the agency goes away from the top-down government and to more, what can we do as humanity, regardless of our geography, to tackle this issue?
Because I did see a recent study that was done. It's like there's a bipartisan consensus at the individual level about wanting a clean environment. Right. Wanting clean air, wanting clean water, like the things that humans can materially, or the things to which human beings as individuals can materially relate. Like, I can imagine drinking a brown cup of water and that poisons me. And I viscerally don't want to do it. I can imagine, I know what it feels like. I spent a good amount of time in China in 2017. I know what it feels like to drink or to breathe air that is saturated with PM 2.5 like particles at very high levels. And it feels like crap. Does like you literally like get a sore throat and like I don't want that, right? You don't want, like, you can imagine, even just thinking about what was the air like in the Industrial Revolution in England, and like it was so bad that actual species of white moths had to evolve and adapt their wing color to be black because there was so much soot on the trees that all the white moths were getting picked off by like birds and owls, right? Like, that's how bad it was. Like, that's like bad. It's like everybody can imagine that they don't want to live in that, right? Right. But then once you start abstracting to these domains of like, well, these complex models of statistical projections of phenomenon like climate are saying that with some probability, and it's like people are asleep already. Right.
And I think it comes back to the question of belonging, right? And participation. That if I ask you the question that you're included in, right? Like, do you want your water to be dirty or not? Do you want your air to be clean or not? Then yeah, I'm a part of this, so therefore but if you're talking about CO2 levels, then it becomes like some people it becomes like, I'm not a part of this. I don't.
If it's like CO2 levels 50 years in the future versus your tax bill today, right? It's like it's hard to make real or make salient that future cost in a way that is capable of coordinating action in the present.
So I think something that's fundamentally changed, and I think it's really only in the last 10 or 20 years, is the ability of one individual to communicate so much more, to have such a bigger voice. Sitting here, right, on your kind of awesome equipment, like this would not have been possible 20 years ago, right? Without a huge capital, like this would have been a TV show.
You need capital expenditure. You need a whole spider organization behind you pushing it out.
You need a camera person. You need and we're just starting. I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of people now have a voice. Everyone has more of a voice, and still like this is probably beyond a lot of people's means, but it's going to be all the equipment that's around us is probably in 10 or 20 years is going to be a little box.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's like we could do some version of this
on a phone,
just on a phone, right? And it's like, okay, well, the production quality might be lower, but the content is still there,
right.
And that kind of maybe speaks to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, where there is this before we got before we were recording, we were talking about this idea of when you remove the gatekeepers, when you remove the disintermediation, and you actually have this immense upswell of content from the bottom up. How do we coordinate, or how do we find a way, an emergent manner of still curating quality or surfacing quality or discovering quality, so that we're not just overwhelmed by noise, and we can actually coordinate the signal responsibly from the bottom up, which seems to be something that we're currently bad at. Like if you look at like fake news, if we look at Twitter, we look at social media, it's like we don't have very good bottom up methods of self-regulating. And so therefore, like Twitter and Facebook and Google are stepping in and acting as these centralized arbiters of moral worth or truth to some extent.
Right. And what happens? So right now, like if I showed you an inaccurate news site, you could probably discern whether it's real or not. Like, and you can discern, frankly, by the language and whether there's right, like
like spelling is actually a decent proxy.
Right. Yeah. What happens when aided by machine learning and I mean, some of the content that we read right now is machine generated. What happens when the content all looks to you like something from the New England Journal of Medicine? It all looks really, really robust.
Yeah.
And as machine learning gets more and more and more intelligent relative to us, it's going to be much more difficult. So my dog has a very hard time distinguishing between that a leash is something artificial. Like everything's part of the natural world, right?
Yeah.
What happens when all the information around us seems to be very accurate and or of high caliber?
Yeah.
And that we then will need each other even more to be able to like, no, I'm actually an expert in this, and no, this doesn't look legit. Or not.
Precisely. I mean, it seems like that's the direction that we're starting to head with movements like liquid democracy, or these delegatory democracy frameworks, where you actually do get this really nice combination or balance between. It's not quite a direct democracy. I mean, it is a form of direct democracy in that everybody gets a vote, but it's these issues-based votes where if I trust you on economics, I can delegate my votes on economic topics to you. And if I trust my friend, my friend Jill on policies regarding, immigration, I can delegate my vote to her on those topics. And then she can delegate those votes, and you can delegate that vote again if you want to kind of like bubble that up even further. So it's kind of this way of the network finding the most trusted experts based on a bottom-up flow of kind of trust.
Yeah, and I think that's where the hope is in all of this.
Yeah.
Is that there is, with our agency, we now can do something about this.
Yeah.
And that we're far more empowered than we were. And that there are very creative approaches to,
Like my favorite part about the last voting cycle that we had, not the presidential voting cycle, but like we had a local voting cycle here in California, and I was very encouraged by seeing a party member, or by not a party member, by a nonpartisan candidate who was actually on this liquid democracy platform, and it was just one, but it was one. Right, it was better than zero.
Right,
and like there's that 0 to 1 idea where it's like, okay, once you've kind of broken through that barrier, who knows how quickly it might flip, and how quickly we might be able to start injecting these new modes of thought, conversation, dialogue, consensus into these old structures, right? I kind of look at it almost like, well, there are different metaphors, and this one might be a little overly violent, but it's kind of, have you ever seen the movie Aliens?
Yeah.
it's kind of like that the alien gets injected into
right. once you do that,
I kind of look at like liquid democracy as like if you can inject that into our current democracy, and then like it'll come out and allow us to be something completely different.
It's Alien through the alien's eyes, which has a happy ending.
Yeah, which has it's like actually evolutionary as opposed to the somewhat tragic human fate. But yeah, because it does help us get past the sticking point of how do you ever get those in power to vote for the reduction of their own power?
Right.
Which is like, it is a pretty difficult sticking point to get around. It's like, how do you vote for people in Congress to effectively, chop their own legs out from underneath them and delegate that voting capacity to a platform, a decentralized platform? It's like never going to happen unless you build it from the bottom up and build it into the candidate's platform from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah. Right. It's like we need a democratic infection.
We need an infection. We need a revolution. I mean, it's clear that we need a revolution, and the question is whether the revolution is going to be within the current system or
Hopefully somewhat bloodless. Like ideally it would be nonviolent revolution.
Yeah, which I think we're seeing. I feel like we're seeing this around us in small ways. There's a bunch of these aliens, and I'm hoping for the best, and I'm hoping that it's a nonviolent, but certainly I think we're seeing such big changes, and I'm still optimistic.
Yeah. Speaking to that, there's have you ever heard of the concept of explosive percolation?
No.
So I just came across an article about this, and it's kind of explosive percolation. So percolation, like kind of your coffee, like water flowing through coffee grounds and percolating through. Explosive, like an explosion. It's this new, basically these ideas flowing out of network sciences, where it's studying how things happen. A little bit, then all at once. Right? And it's this notion of really studying how localized networks start kind of evolving. And then at some point, the localized networks all snap into one macro super connected network, right? And so it's like, it can seem as if things aren't happening. And then all at once, something can just like snap together and emerge very quickly out of that. And so, I'm hoping what we're seeing is something like that. And that seems kind of like what you're saying.
I think so. There's enough. I was looking at the Summer of Love recently, and you're like, you hear a lot of the conversations from Summer of Love, and they sound eerily familiar to the conversations that are going on. And again, without putting a normative value, like you think about all of the second, third order effects of what happened then, and
and it's hard to draw a straight line there, but we have a feeling that like something was certainly started at that point, and kind of like shifted the culture, and again we're kind of part of that new cultural paradigm. So cool. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Ori. I really had a wonderful conversation. I think we covered quite a bit of ground.
Quite a bit, this was really enjoyable.
Would always love to have you on the show again and talk more, but good luck with the new book, and I'm sure I'll see you around the Starfish community. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Cool. Take it easy, everybody.